yard system, an 18 cubic yard system, 37 cubic yards, and then finally a 600 cubic yard system. So you can kind of see how some of the fundamentals that we talk about at the beginning can scale up. We'll talk about some resources and then questions and discussion. At any time, because we are a small group, feel free to unmute yourself and share a story or a question, or use the chat for putting questions in. So just real quickly, what is a conservation district? And these are agencies that almost every county in the nation has one, and they were founded in the 40s during the Dust Bowl with a mission of helping people on private land to manage public resources more sustainably. So for one way that six ways that the Whatcom Conservation District does this work is we have an equipment share program. We help to connect people with excess manure if we have clients who need to export if they're not using it on site. We have a number of different incentive programs, including grants and rebates to help people install the practices that we talk about. We offer a soil testing program, complementary soil testing. We provide free manure pile tarps. And then we host workshops and events like what you're seeing today. And all that is kind of part of our conservation planning segment of our programming. We also have a restoration program and an education program that have separate bodies of work than this. And each district and each county will be somewhat different, although there's a great similarity. All the districts that are in the same Puget Sound region, we all share practices and materials and outreach. And so there's an umbrella organization called Better Ground that can help you if you're in the Puget Sound Basin to find the district that's near you or any other area in Whatcom County, in Washington State. At this moment, we're going to throw a quick poll up to get another touch point to get a sense of who's in the audience. So if you could go ahead and complete this poll to let us know what county do you live in, if you've worked with the conservation district before, and whether or not you are raising animals currently, or if you're just planning for the future. And it looks like we're at about sort of half and half with having worked with us before or worked with a district before. Majority of you are raising animals currently, and none of you are from my county, but many of you are from Snohomish and other. Interesting. We're still a small group. A few more of you have joined. We're at like maybe 13 now. So you can see the poll results. And while we're taking those in, anyone who's just joined who would like to unmute and share what it is you're hoping to get from the presentation today or add it to the chat, that would be a really nice way to get it started. All right, at that, I'm going to move on with the slides. So basic concepts. Oh, first of all, let me give a thank you to two farms who shared their slides with me to help to prepare this. And that is Midnight's Farm on Lopez Island. They're going to be the large case study, our 600 cubic yard case study, and then Small Acres Farm here in Whatcom County will be our mid-size case study. O2 Compost is a consultant working out of Snohomish County, and some of the systems that you'll hear about today are from them, and my family is actually working with them right now for design and permitting of a large aerated composting system as well. So 30,000 foot view within the context of conservation planning, aerated compost is one way to implement a practice that a conservation district really generally might call waste storage structure. Or maybe more specifically, it might be called manure storage and composting structure. And all the practices that you see mentioned here are all practices that conservation districts and our partner agency, which is a USDA federal agency called the Natural Resources Conservation Service. They tend to work with a bit larger scale farms and with dairies. They also use all the same sort of jargon. They talk about practices that are all really general, and then the implementation of that practice will have to be really specific to each of the farmers and you who know your site. And so within this suite of practices, we're going to just zero in on the waste storage structure and talk about what it might look like if you were to have some air forced in there. Big picture also, what are we trying to accomplish by this composting process? So in the wintertime, I guess just going back real quick, in the wintertime, in the Pacific Northwest and the Puget Sound region, best practice is to keep animals off your soil. I don't know if any of you guys are on the east side, but things might be different where you're farming, but over here, the soil becomes saturated. It just is very hard, no matter your soil type, to have animals on it in the winter. So we're putting them in a heavy use area or a sacrifice area, and usually collecting manure or bedding and manure, footing and manure, and stockpiling it in a storage until it can be spread in the growing season. And so goals while we're stockpiling it is that we're trying to get it to break down from just manure and bedding to be a stable soil-like material that is going to improve the soil tilth and fertility when it's applied. And one way to do that is there's a chemical process of primary and secondary composting that will stabilize the carbon and nitrogen in the compost so that it becomes plant available. Another goal which we're trying to accomplish is to reduce the volume and the weight of what we've initially put in, reduce pathogens and weeds so that we're not spreading those every time we spread our composted manure. And really ultimately, this spreading a good compost can seed the soil with even beneficial microbes and create soil conditions that lead to microbial health, which leads to plant health, which in turn leads to animal health. So even above and beyond why compost, why aerate, why talk about forcing air into the pile? And you see here a windrow aerated compost and then a composting shed, both of which we're going to talk more about in detail. And one huge reason is it speeds up the primary composting time to roughly 1 month. And that's assuming that we have all of our other factors in balance. You have your correct nitrogen, carbon, correct wetness, correct amount of air in the pile, and that the material is all been mixed to be somewhat homogeneous. And then also it helps us to ensure that we hit the temperatures to kill parasite eggs, larvae, and weed seeds. So if you're managing pigs, for example, or managing any livestock where you have a concern that you don't want to be creating parasite life cycle on your farm, hitting these temperatures is really important, and knowing that, measuring that, stay in there for 3 days, and we'll talk all about that. If you're managing animals and you have any volume of butcher waste, the aerated compost, because you can ensure that you're hitting the right temperatures by your management and by tracking your temperature, it can give you a good assurance that you're quickly composting any butcher waste like viscera or hides, which, for example, from my family's farm, we're harvesting 100 pigs a year, and our butcher comes to the farm. So that's 100 pigs, big pigs, viscera, and hides each year. And then also by aerating the pile, there's a huge reduction in the moisture content of the pile, and it's reducing the danger of runoff into the environment. Just a quick note, up and coming, that this aerated composting is such an important tool for parasite management that there are researchers at the Rodale Institute who are researching thermophilic or aerated composting in organic pork systems, and my family and I have a grant to study along with them. And now into the vocab. So you're going to see this a lot. This little picture here is a blower, and they come in different sizes, different horsepowers, but they're fairly affordable, fairly straightforward. They're often used to power those crazy floppy advertising things on the side of the road. This is usually the blower that's powering it. And the static pile part of the name means that because we're forcing the air in, There's a lot less emphasis on turning the pile by hand or by tractor, because the point of doing the turning or the stirring is to get air in. The other point of the stirring and the mixing is to create a homogeneous mix. So if you have a bunch of different feedstocks, that's another vocabulary going in, you want it to be mixed. So sometimes there is mixing before putting it into an aerated system. And then composting, official definition there, making a transition from the original feedstocks to a soil, basically. And then also composting by definition is an aerobic process. I guess you can have anaerobic composting and aerobic, but what we are shooting for is aerobic composting, which means no smell to the layperson. So if you ever start noticing an odor of rotten eggs or leaves or anything, or excuse me, anything unsavory, we're in an anaerobic composting. So here you can start to see some of the components put together, and this is in the little shed that was aerating the windrow, but the components will be the same whether you're aerating bays or a windrow or a shed or whatnot. There's some kind of timer controller so that you are basically telling your blower to cycle on and off for certain amounts of time. There is a junction box or a relay, so you need power to this system, which can oftentimes be one of the more expensive parts of getting it installed. A switched outlet, there's the timer again, and then your blower. And it's nice to have a place to keep the elements off of these components. So you see here, there's just been a little box built. I think we'll see another example of a Rubbermaid tub, something to keep it out of the elements. Just to give you a sense budget-wise that we're not talking about outrageously expensive things. Even to get these days fairly updated digital timers that will, a timer outlet that will allow you to set the program for your blower to cycle on and off. Fairly affordable. There's some fittings involved and a PPC, but all of these are available. So again, we're going to talk a lot about temperature here. So I just wanted to sort of show that PFRP, so process to further reduce pathogens, in the USDA organic standard, in order to call a compost or to use a compost in a certified organic system, you need to prove that you've hit 131 degrees Fahrenheit at least for 3 days. So that's a really nice benchmark that even as a backyard composter we can use to know that we're killing most pathogens. This actual little call out here is talking about even 1 day at 122 degrees Fahrenheit. And then it tells you for this is actually from the Human Manure Handbook. So kind of interesting side note and a great resource, that a lot of human parasites are killed at a bit lower target. But that is a really nice standard to keep in mind. This slide is an emphasis of the importance of the oxygen in the composting process and shows the very quick way that the microbes, the aerobic microbes in a compost pile can consume the oxygen that is in there. And it's kind of one way to make the point that turning a pile mechanically, unless you want to be turning it a lot, which I'm guessing maybe none of us want to, unless maybe we have a few clients who do really have great composting programs and they do turn it by hand, but very quickly the oxygen that you're introducing by turning physically is going to be consumed by the biology in the pile. And then we're going to be back to them struggling for air and looking for oxygen again. So having a way to force the air in is basically a way for you to control the temperature of the pile. And so we're going to look at this graph in a little more detail in the next slide. But basically, you know, I had a client asking, or a participant in my last workshop saying, well, I think I built the pile right, I've got the right wetness, but the temperature isn't going above 40 degrees. It's like cold even. And my guess is he was talking about using straw as a feedstock. And so my guess is it really matted down and there's not enough air in the pile for the temperature to rise. It has not too much to do with external temperature, but rather with the temperature is a result of the microbial activity in the pile, believe it or not. So when there's air, the microbes can work, they generate energy, and we see that as heat. And so here's an example where there even was too much air blown into the system. So that's something to think about, and that was keeping temperatures low. And then they got the air just right, so the temperature just spiked right up, hit past 150, and then the air was slowly begun to be consumed by the microbes. So even as the blower was on, the temperature was reducing. Oh, I guess what's going on, this is over a few months. So you see tiny cycles of temperature within that the blower would cycle on and off. But the overall temperature over the first month of primary composting was decreasing. And then when the blower was unplugged and the on and off cycles stopped and it just went to the secondary composting, the temperature returned to ambient. Any questions so far? I don't want to derail us too much. We're still in the basics, but feel free to type anything into the chat at any time. So you started to see that measuring temperature is really important and something that will be really fun for you to do. And you can do that with as simple as a probe, which has like a really long reading stick. It's like a meat thermometer basically, but with just a really long reader. And you can put it into the pile. That allows you to read the pile right at that one place. Or this is also really affordable, this wireless tag. And it has a probe that goes into the pile, and you can read it on your telephone. So this is a readout from a compost pile where the air was turned on. You see the ambient air temperature cycling up and down throughout the day, and then you see the temperature of the pile as the air was being introduced over a few days get up to 170. And this shows an example how you can have these wireless tags are neat. You can have them around the farm and they're telling you a few different things. So still on composting 101. 101, we've got carbon and nitrogen, and we need a lot more carbon than nitrogen. Carbon usually is like brown dead things, although big pieces don't count. In the case, let's take the example of my family's pig farm. The carbon that we're using is close to 400 cubic yards of wood shavings and straw. And then our nitrogen usually is your manure, and we're using only really probably between 40 and 80 cubic yards of pig manure and the animal waste per year. So having the right ratio of carbon and nitrogen really important. And then avoiding feedstocks that might have persistent herbicides. This is, I guess, if you're using herbicide on your farm, or if you're doing, we'll talk a little bit about aerated windrow where the farmer's composting dairy solids in order to amend annual veggie fields. And this is what they do, is they take some of that compost before putting it on their field and grow out some peas to see how the peas are doing. And if they're looking like this, struggling, then they know there might be some herbicide present in the pile. Really basic bioassay that they're doing to just make sure that nothing's getting through. So porosity, this is back to what I was saying about, like, say you're using something like straw as one of your feedstocks, or mowed grass comes to mind, or even dead leaves. These are all things that can kind of pack together depending on how wet they are, and you're not able to get air through. So mixing those materials with something else smaller and more crumbly, like a shavings or whatever other inputs you can find, so that you have a homogeneous mix and a nice pore space within the pile. And then moisture content, you want to keep in mind that you're shooting for the wetness of a wrung out sponge, which ends up being equivalent to about 65% moisture, but that you might need to actually wet the pile depending on time of year, how much evaporation, whether or not you have a roof, how much the air is blowing through. There's a lot of factors, but in order to keep that correct moisture for the microbes to be happy, you might find you need to actually create a higher initial moisture so that as you go through the aeration is still working. So now we're going to move into the case study. So I'm going to pause for a breath and see if anyone has any questions. Looks like, is this type of system reasonable in a small operation is one question. And so you'll see my first case study will be a woman who's managing 1 miniature pony and 1 horse. And so I'm going to say yes, 100% useful in a small operation. And we're going to talk about a couple of those now. Is anyone in the audience currently doing any aerated composting? You could put it in the chat or unmute yourself and share. Sounds like no. Okay, moving on to the case studies. First case study is what we call the micro bin. And this is a term that was coined by O2 Compost. So again, shout out to the fabulous partner there. So this client has 1 horse, and you see her winter paddock up here, 1 horse and 1 pony, and she created a 5 and 5, 2 5 cubic yard bins. The way the micro bin works is you contract with O2 for the plans and training and all the fittings, the pipes, the blower, and then you build your own bin. So this is how she chose to construct hers. The pipes in the bottom of the bin with the holes facing downwards to prevent clogging. So it does look like a solid pipe, but there are holes all throughout, all along that pipe. And then this little frame was built in order to protect the pipes when she's going to be removing the material. And her blower, she put it between the two, and each bin gets 2 manifolds. And then this little black contraption here is a gate valve so that she can close the gate to 1 bin if she just wants the air to go into one. She can have them both open if she's trying to aerate them both. And you see the power, she had to bring power to this site. That was probably the largest cost of the installation, was she just had to trench and bring this conduit over here and put this little outlet so that she could plug in. She had a little bit of a slope that she could dig into, and she chose not to build it with swing open doors in the front. The next one we're going to see had swing open doors in the front. So in order to get it in, get the manure into the bin, she used a bit of the slope from the back, and that's also where the animals are housed, and created a little bit of a steep entry point there, but it worked for her. And then she also, the bins don't really come with roof plans, so she created a roof that was topped with OSB. And in the next one, you'll see a really nice design for a wooden frame topped with Tyvek, so that you're not dealing with anything too heavy, but also it can be tacked down in the wind. So that's one example. And so you can kind of take this how, in your own direction with just the concept of the piping, and then try to imagine what type of housing would work best in your scenario for getting those pipes stabilized and creating a place to build up around. So we're going to move into our second case study, which this system has a total capacity of 18 cubic yards. This landowner has their own 5 llamas and 2 goats, but they have this really big facility, so they're boarding 4 horses, and they were actually boarding 3 working oxen, working with the farmer who his oxen that are trained to pull farm equipment. It's pretty cool, really big animals. And they had this really great slope. The previous landowner had been just dumping the manure over the slope. No aeration, no composting, no cover. And so they chose to create this concrete block retaining wall. They hired a contractor to do that for them. And there's a gravel base. And then they built this wooden structure, which you can start to see it taking shape here. And it's going to hold 3 bins, basically 3 of those micro bins that we saw in case study number 1. But these are all conjoined within the same structure, and you can see the holes there for when they put their piping in. Really nice construction here. So they're going to be able to just walk out the barn and tip the wheelbarrow right in to the bin. This is a image of the previous pile and the oxen drawn manure spreader that they were using to manage that, some of the animals on their farm. And this is a picture of the finished bin. They kind of switched their door design halfway through. They built the first one and then they were like, you know what? I think it would be lighter weight and easier to use if we did a swinging door. So the first one shows you like case study number 1. I think those are stacking slats. And then they realized, oh, this would be a lot more user friendly. So we've got huge hinges and then the whole thing swings open. And then this really lovely lid here is just frame with Tyvek stapled on that they can pin down in high winds. And so again, the construction shot. This is inside, so the door is swung open. There's just a soil base, which is, there's some advantages to that. People say if you're composting that the naturally occurring biology in the soil is going to be able to get into the pile easier. You don't have a big concrete slab or even gravel pad that's preventing that from happening. Again, the aeration tubes, they're capped and the holes are punched very, very tightly spaced, almost like every inch or so, but facing down so that they're not going to get clogged with material over time. And they put these 2 concrete blocks for a tractor bucket runner, so that when they're using a tractor to remove material in here, you can see their garden waste all piled up, ready to get started. And all this stuff would probably at this point count as nitrogen, or excuse me, carbon. It's all just mostly dead woody material. And so that will be a really nice base to put a whole bunch of some manure on top of. And so that kind of lasagna method is a nice way to think about it if you're not going to be mixing by hand or mixing it around. So behind the bins, now you can see they've got the piping installed, the gate valve. So each bin has 2 manifolds, and then there's a connector that runs through a little hole in the Rubbermaid tub and to their blower, just the outlet for the blower, and runs to power that's at the barn, which they also had to pay to have that outlet put on the outside of their barn. And then this will deliver air to the next 2 bins. But pretty straightforward.
Hey, Katie, I just want to point out if you go back a slide, because I've been looking at this photo, I don't know how many times, and I just noticed the Rubbermaid has air slots cut into the sides
Nice.
so that the fan can still get air,
Nice.
but you have it covered from the elements from above. So important to think about where you're installing your fan.
Nice. Okay, moving up in scale is the small acres example. And so this is an intensive veggie farm, but they also have some animal activity. So they wanted a shed where they could compost like fresh animal manures, or they have a big flock of layers. So if they had any chicken mortalities, they would have a place where they could sort of keep that a little more managed and contained and waste from the veggie farm. But then they also needed a large amount of organic material roughly once a year to amend their veggie fields. So they have a shed, and then they're also using a windrow. So this is kind of overview of the farm. It's 5 acres, I believe. And if you see right here, this was 1 year's windrow, I think, being used. So you can kind of see the scope of the windrow within the farm. And this is also about, this is before the shed was built, and this is about the footprint of the shed as well, once it was constructed. So the windrow system is one that is, there's a really great, I'm going to just skip forward real quick, On-Farm Composting Handbook has a lot of really neat examples, and that is a great place to see this diagram that shows you're creating, you're laying out your pipe, and it could be this solid pipe with lots of holes. could be, we've been using the corrugated perf pipe that people often use to install when they install a French drain. We've been using that to great effect, and just you want to cap one end, the other end will be open for your blower, and then you want some sort of carbon material with a lot of pore space right immediately on top of your manifold. And so at my farm we use straw. We'll unroll a bunch of straw bales on top because we have a lot of that material, but you can also use wood chips or other carbon. And then this really homogeneous material that you see being dumped on top, that's what they're going to compost. And this is a really unique situation where they're getting, there's a lot of dairies in our county, and so they're able to get separated cow manure solids where the liquids have, it's passed through a manure separator, and so it kind of comes out, it's practically composted already, really beautiful material, but they're doing a thermophilic heated composting on it, partially because they're a certified organic farm and they want it to hit, they need to be able to prove that it hit the 131 for 3 days to introduce it into an organic system, and also because it creates a more stable material for their veggie fields. So you see the live bottom truck from the dairy arriving, delivering, dropping it off. You don't necessarily have to have the landscape fabric on the bottom. That was kind of a fancy touch to keep the weeds down, make it easier to clean up after the fact, get more of the material out. And this shows the finished pile. So let's see, I'm going to go back real quick to this diagram. There is an interesting note here that it's ideal when you're building these if you're able to put a cover layer of finished compost over to inoculate the pile with healthy aerobic composting bacteria. If you're not able to do that, no big deal, you can still move on. But minimally, I would recommend a cover of some kind, especially if we're in the rainy season, but in order to create the right pressure differential within the pile. So you see the blower set up, and the pile gets started. And then now to look at the shed system. So this one was sized exactly for their tractor, for the width of the bucket of their tractor, and they were using the slatted front. So you can see the two runners here, and the slats fit in between. You can also see in the background what they were previously using, which was pallets. And that's something I talk with my clients a lot about, is that's a great way to get started before you spend a lot of dollars in building something, to start with pallets so you can practice composting, and also so that you know that that location will work long term and be the most efficient one for your farm. This is the finished product, really lovely structure. They have the apron in front, concrete apron, so that as they're operating it in the wintertime, they're not creating a huge muddy mess right in front and easier to scrape. And the roof allows them to control the moisture in the pile and diminishes runoff. And they were able to extend the roof out a little bit in the back and create a storage area. Again, you can see what they were previously using is just the pallet bins, which is a great way to get started. But you can see the forming of the concrete, and then each of the bins has a specially formed cutaway, and the pipe is going to be sitting in free airspace here, and then the little stub out for what will eventually get connected to the blower. The pour. So now we've got the fixtures for the shed, and it's hard to see, but each of these cutouts also has a little lip that's been formed in there so that we can put boards over top of it. So you see the lip that was formed in, and the dimensional lumber will fit over loosely and create sort of a false bottom. And that will, you can actually, in this one, the holes are probably on both sides of the manifold. So there's like 1 inch spacing on those holes, probably both sides. And then these boards will be loosely fit, and the air will come out into this open space, and then the material won't be sitting directly on the pipes in this case. This is the back, so you can see their gate valves for each bin, and then the air delivery system with the blower. Pretty simple electronics for the timer, the blower timer. And I guess that's it. We're moving on to case study number 4. Which is pretty huge, pretty big jump here. But just to show, you know, if you were really ambitious, what you could do, this is a really unique situation on Lopez Island, where if I'm not mistaken, there was no green waste composting. And so this farm saw a niche. They were really into heavy equipment, and they invested in this facility and also in a huge chip grinder. We'll see some images of it. So they take in green waste compost. That's what this huge pile is in the background. And they have a certification from the WSDA. They also manage animals, and this shows you some of the scale of the equipment that they're working with. Is this huge track hoe, I guess it's called. And then this is the conveyor belt that comes off of the tub grinder. So they're making mountains and mountains of carbonaceous material that they can use as a feedstock to balance out the nitrogen that their farm is producing in the form of butcher waste or animal bedding and manure, etc. So again, this overview, and we'll be looking at this quite a bit more, but this is all their sort of manure and composting is concentrated in one area of the farm, and the slope is in this direction. This covered area is for animals and to house finished compost. And you can see this heavy use area or sacrifice yard for winter cows in the background. This is a large slab area for mixing and grinding. And then this is the aerated bin right here. And normally there are tarps over. You can see how it looks, the piles look kind of compressed. And they have really unique, this is a really unique construction. I've not really seen one quite like this anywhere else, but they chose not to waste space with bay dividers. It all just goes into one, but in their minds, they consider it 4 bays. And this is adjacent to that. There's yet another area where you can see their tub grinder, and they're sorting out, you know, big woody material and then stockpiling wood chips from their yard waste composting operation. Just to show you a little bit what goes into the permit that they have, the partners that they worked with the Natural Resources Conservation Service, which has a wonderful grant for farmers to improve water quality, basically by installing practices on the farm like this. And so they worked with EQIP for funding, and then with the WSDA, or sorry, with the Department of Ecology for an agricultural composting facility exemption. So super interesting, allows them to sell the compost that they're making, and sort of makes it clear that they're not a municipal composter, that they are also a farm. And just to call out the fact that they constructed and were thoughtful about the runoff from this facility. So especially if you don't have a roof, or if you're getting bigger and bigger, just to be conscious that all these facilities are going to have some kind of runoff that you're going to have to deal with, and that you want to keep out of surface water. And so if that's going into a vegetated treatment area or a large area of grass where there's never any animals, where the soil and the vegetation can take it up, that's a really important concept. So just a little more about what it means to be an exempt on-farm compost facility, what that definition is from our Department of Ecology. So super interesting. They have a feedstock requirement that 50% are agricultural, and there's yearly testing and reporting. So this one has a few videos that shows their wetting and mixing process. So I'm going to see if I can get those to play. I'm not sure if that's going to work, but you can see the size of material, the size of equipment they're using to load the material out once it's finished. Their aeration detail from the back, you know, much bigger, but similar concept to everything else we've been looking at, with the one blower here, and then PVC and gate valves, and it's going through the slab. A little bit more complicated inverter because they're running a stronger blower to power all that, all this length of pipe. So this shows you the detail in the pipe. I'm going to show you another example of a really large composted that's more similar to the small acres, where there's kind of an open space called a plenum that's covered with boards, a false bottom board, false bottom. But these guys decided to put these little stub outs with tiny holes. So as soon as the slab was poured, it reached to the level of this little tiny stub out coming out of the tube, and that cap was removed. And so those holes are in the slab and go straight into the aeration channel, and they start every pile with a big layer of wood chips to keep the compost and material from plugging up those holes. This talks about their feedstocks, that they're using butcher waste and animal bedding, and then the green waste that they're grinding that they get from the island. And then this slide shows them they're going to take this huge pile of green waste, run it through the tub grinder, and create some carbon material. Oh, it's showing you. Just in case you were thinking about getting a tub grinder, now you're definitely going to want to get a tub grinder. How cool is that? Okay, next slide. So this goes back to the importance of maybe even sometimes pre-wetting the pile, but also making sure that there's a homogeneous mix of materials, that you don't have like the butcher waste all over here in one big pile and then the wood chips over here. It's important that it be mixed. So this shows a huge amount of water being introduced to the pile and then mixing it before they put it into the aerated system. So obviously we're all not working at this scale, but you can imagine something a little bit smaller that might happen like in a big pile on the apron in front of your bin, let's say, or just on in a pile on the ground before you put it in your pallets. And this shows the temperature tracking that they're doing for their different bins, each color being a different bin, and up here being the 150 mark. So they're interestingly enough bringing up the point that they're actually trying to keep it below 150 degrees. That there is also, if you get above 150 and in the like 170 range, that is almost too hot for a lot of the microbes that produce optimal compost. And other microbes start operating at those temperatures, similar to if we get too little air, then other microbes start operating that are not producing ideal compost conditions. Here's another example of a larger structure. These would be looking down from above, ecology blocks, tube in the background, and the pipe, the air delivery pipe is pushing air into a little cutout in the slab. And this open plenum would have little dimensional boards set across it, and then the air just equalizes inside the plenum and is forced up into the pile. And this is another very lovely looking large aerated compost. So you can see the false bottom here covering those open channels and your blower on the side. This drawing came from O2. So just hopefully got you interested, and I would love to invite you to reach out to your local conservation district to see if they have any financial or technical support that they could offer if you're interested in installing one of these systems at your own site. We'd love to talk with you more about them now as well. A couple resources for further research. Start thinking of your questions so that we can have a discussion. And you know, even if you don't have any questions, I would love to hear from participants what ideas this might have inspired for you.
Katie, we do have one question. Are there USDA restrictions on types of animal manure you can compost to add to row crops or vegetable garden beds?
As far as I know, the restriction is only the 131 for 3 days. Other than that, you can compost non-organic animal manure and still have it be considered organic. The word organic is not in this question, but I'm assuming that when you say USDA restrictions, you mean for organic certification. So the answer is no.
There aren't any more questions in the chat box. Oh, there you go. How long do you run the blowers?
That is a great question, and the answer is a little bit of a depends. But it's something like, for example, might depend on how wet is the pile when you're starting, or how much porosity is there in the pile, how big is the pile, and also you can fine tune it by watching your temperature. But it's something in the range of like 15 minutes on, 30 minutes off. There's kind of this really regular cycling when you have a pile being aerated for that. Usually about 1 month is, no matter the size of the pile, if you have all the conditions correct, the right wetness, the right amount of pore space, the right carbon to nitrogen, usually for about 1 month we will have it on a regular cycle of about 15 minutes on, 30 minutes off. After that 1 month of primary composting, it's ideal if you can also allow it to do some secondary composting just to sort of further stabilize itself. But that does not need to be aerated. Ideally, that secondary composting, it would be shielded from a rain if you're in the Pacific Northwest, so that it doesn't go back to being totally saturated and anaerobic.
Well, unless anyone wants to unmute themselves and ask a question or share something they're doing with everyone else.
Can I ask a question?
Please.
Yes, please do.
Have you ever considered using any sort of geothermal adaptation so that you wouldn't have to run a fan? Like digging down far enough, using the venting system, but just using a geothermal heat source, would that work?
I don't know. I've never considered it, and I haven't personally seen an example. But if anybody gets to it first, let us know. Probably in Iceland, maybe they're doing it, but I don't have any context for that. Again, because it's not really temperature that we're looking for. The microbes, they don't need temperature, they generate it. What they need is air.
Well, I think if there's no more questions or if there's anything else you want to add, Katie, I just want to thank you for presenting, Katie, and thank WSU for hosting Cattleman's. There are still so many classes left to attend, and we are excited that both of us have finished presenting and now we can start attending other classes. And something to mention, this recording you will receive along with all the other classes as follow-up to Cattleman School. WSU will provide that. And additionally, the Whatcom CD, we will be posting the 3 presentations that we gave on our Whatcom CD YouTube channel. Or you can also access them on our website or our Facebook. And we're hoping to have them up by early next week. And I think WSU is also hoping to send out the recordings to all the classes. I think there's like 80 of them that happen in the next 3 days. So you'll be able to see classes that you weren't able to attend in person, which is a fantastic part of Zoom classes.
There was one last question there, Karina, which is about soil testing in pastures, not necessarily related to composting, although the reason to compost is to apply all this stuff to your pasture. And if you're applying nutrients to a field or a pasture, it's nice to be sending your soil to a lab to check its chemistry so that you can make sure you're not overloading any particular nutrient, overdoing it. And in Whatcom County, if you're interested in soil testing and you're managing animals, you can contact the Conservation District, and we have a complimentary soil testing program where we actually come out and sample, get it to a lab for you, and help interpret it. If you're not in Whatcom County, you could just basically probably Google soil testing. There's some labs that work nationally, and oftentimes you can send them the sample in the mail. The lab that we're going to be working with this year for our complimentary soil testing is in Snohomish County, I believe, maybe
Nope,
Skagit.
Skagit.
And it's got a great name, easy to find. Simply Soil Testing is the lab in Burlington. And there's a bunch of other great ones around.
And if you're in King County, they also offer soil testing. You just have to submit the soil sample to the Conservation District, and then they mail it off, and they use a lab that's down in Portland. I don't have more details than that. You'll have to go look at their website. But yeah, each conservation district may have a soil testing service that they offer. So it's definitely worth checking out your local CD. Great. Well, thank you everyone for taking time this afternoon to attend, and enjoy the rest of Cattleman's. And it's been great being able to be a part of this online virtual winter school. So have a good rest of your day. Enjoy the rest of your classes.
Thanks,
and
everybody.
contact your CD. So bye.